There's this scene in The Great Gatsby, if you remember, where Nick Carraway is having lunch with Jay Gatsby, and Jay Gatsby takes him over to the table where he introduces him to his friend Mayor Wolfsheim, who he says to Nick Carraway, he says, "This is the man who fixed the 1919 World Series," and Gatsby says it matter-of-factly, and this sort of stuns Nick Carraway, who's the naive sort of boy in the scene, and it stuns him, he says, because although everyone knew that the series had been fixed, he said, I merely thought of it as an event in an inevitable chain, that this thing had simply happened. And so the idea that he was meeting the man who had actually done this thing, it stuns him. And of course, Mayor Wolfsheim is based on a real person. It's based on Arnold Rothstein, who did, in fact, fix the 1919 World Series and then was assassinated at the Park Central Hotel in 1928 in New York City. If you've watched the show Boardwalk Empire, you've seen Arnold Rothstein. He's a gambler, a sort of entrepreneurial but illicit businessman. And it's this spectacular scene because it's encapsulating the real world that Gatsby comes from, with the sort of naivete and ignorance of the jazz age. And so this idea that Peter Thiel was responsible for something almost as audacious and unbelievable and conspiratorial as setting out to destroy and then in fact successfully destroying a media outlet, to me was a similar event. And the idea that I remember following the story as it was developing, and like not only everyone else watching, but the people on the other side of this conspiracy, I assumed that everything was what it seemed. And of course it wasn't. Forbes and the New York Times break Thiel's involvement in late May 2016. And it's this sort of stunning, momentous occasion. It turns out there was more to the story. I remember as I was researching the book, I was reading this biography of Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of his post-presidential autobiographies, and he was saying that he remembered too this moment in 1919 when the news broke that the World Series, which he had watched in real time, was revealed to have been a conspiracy, that there had been more to the story. And this is his sort of this is Eisenhower, who, contrary to his public perception, was also this wily, sort of manipulative strategist. Even Nixon would comment that Eisenhower was far more cunning than he appeared, which I think if Nixon says you're cunning, that probably says something. But anyways, this is his awakening. He says, from then onwards, I never trusted first reports. He was skeptical. It sort of opened his eyes to this larger thing. So again, the idea that a singular individual was responsible for this incredible, nearly unbelievable conspiracy was sort of a moment like that for me, and it's what attracted me to writing this book. I wanted to know about this person that had done so. And so Peter Thiel sent me an email in late summer 2016, and he said, I've read your articles before. There was something we read during the trial. Would you want to get together sometime? And I said, of course, this would be fascinating. And I remember thinking about that there might be some book here, that there might be an interesting project if I could get the access. And I called Robert Greene, who was my mentor, who was sort of my idol as a writer, the person I try to get guidance from when I'm starting or embarking on a new project. And we were talking about it, and I said, it's this unbelievable conspiracy. I can't believe this happened. And he said, well, have you read Machiavelli on conspiracies? And I had, in college, and I'd flip through it from time to time. But he said, you pick up Discourses on Livy and read the Conspiracies chapter, which I did. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in there. Machiavelli is talking about the three different parts of a conspiracy. He says there's the planning, the doing, and the aftermath. He says a line which appears a bunch of times in the book. He says, basically a man who is cornered, who has nothing to lose, becomes very dangerous to the prince. The people who are backed into a corner are the sort of most dangerous enemies. And so I read this. I was fascinated by it. And in December of 2016, I had dinner with Peter here in New York. He has an apartment about a few blocks from here in Union Square. And I walked into his apartment. His private chef comes out, who's sort of also his doorman. It was a little strange. But he takes your coat, and this is how the intro of the book obviously goes as well. He takes your coat, he lays it down, and I don't know if you guys have this habit, but as soon as I get in someone's house, I like to snoop and look at all the books that they have. And Thiel's apartment is filled with books, different shelves of different kinds. Some of them are art books, some of them are economics books. There was a surprising amount of books about chess. And as I walked towards the window, which looks out over Union Square Park, this book caught my eye, and it was Discourses on Livy. And it struck me what an incredible coincidence that this sort of defining work on conspiracies happened to sit on the shelf of a man who had just sort of redefined what a modern conspiracy might look like. And it was in that moment that I decided I would absolutely need to write this book. And as it happened, I was going to Nick Denton's apartment the following evening for a discussion he was hosting, sort of a salon. And again, I walk into Denton's apartment, and you climb these stairs. You walk into the apartment. There's no doorman, no private chef to take your coat. He had just removed back into the apartment after being forced to vacate it while they sorted out the financial issues of the verdict. And as I looked at his shelves, I saw a different book. It wasn't Machiavelli, but it was Seneca, which made perfect sense. The Stoics, which my other books are about, are the sort of perfect author that you would turn, in the way that you would turn to Machiavelli if you have some cunning plot that you are engaged in. You would turn to Seneca when you are the victim of said plot. Although Seneca himself was a conspirator, he's assassinated for conspiring against Nero, or at least being complicit in allowing the plot to continue. But Seneca was someone who knew what it was like to lose everything. Seneca is exiled early in his career. He's sent to this deserted island, essentially. He loses everything. The Stoics talk about what it is like to find yourself on the receiving end of a brutal, perhaps unfair treatment, the shifts of fortune. And so it just struck me as being this juxtaposition that I could not resist. And so I wanted to understand everything about it. I was absolutely hooked. I felt like I couldn't not write this book. And I've said before, I said this in Perennial Seller, to me that's the only reason to write a book, that you can't not write it, that it's this thing that you can't stop thinking about, that it will not get out of your head. And I think this story was that for me. Of course, the first problem was, how the fuck do you write this thing? There's only so much space. It's already been extensively covered. The weirdest part about the book, or the hardest part for me, I thought, okay, well, first I'm going to read all the legal documents. And so I had my assistant go on the Pinellas County website, the clerk's office. You can look at all the case files. And I said, hey, will you download these and then print them out and send them to me? And he said, sure. And he came back about an hour later and he said, the file is like 200 gigs. It's 25,000 pages. And so I said, oh, wow, that's a lot. Maybe we need to send it to some sort of like Kinko's or something, and they can put it in binders. And he went to them, and I think their initial bid was like $2,000 to print all these files. And so I said, that's not going to work. And so we went through and we eliminated all the redundancies. There's all the extra pages at the end of the documents, and it narrowed it down to I think about 17,000 pages of court documents, which I had to read. I think it cost $1,200 to have them all printed. It filled 16 binders. And it was 6 or 7 full boxes of paper. And the day I was supposed to start reading these and working on them, my son was born. And I thought, oh, well, this will be easy. He'll sleep a lot, and then I'll read while he's sleeping, which was painfully naive in its own way. And then, of course, I had to start interviewing. And so I interviewed Peter and Nick and AJ and Charles Harder, who's the attorney who tries the case. I interview Hulk Hogan. I interview the notorious Mr. A, who's the originator of the plot, which I'll get into a little bit more later. And so I have all this material. It takes a few months to fully gather. And so now I have, probably 30,000 pages worth of things to go through. And to make sense of this incredibly vast series of events. And so the first thing we did with the book is we said, okay, let's just map this out, right? Let's figure out what happened. And that took, this is my timeline. And the timeline alone for the book was a mere 55,000 words and 129 pages, merely to go from March of 2002 when Gawker launches, and then we cut it artificially early. It ends on February 6, 2017 is when the timeline ends. And then subsequent events would continue to happen. But this vast document was my starting point. And at first I had to wrap my head around what the hell exactly happened. And it was, if you'll indulge me, I'll sort of walk you through the story really fast. There's some spoilers here, but we had to make some selections about what could be included and not included. But some of these things I find to be very interesting. If you really want to think about what happened, yes, in some ways it begins when Gawker outs Peter Thiel as gay. In 2007, December of 2007, they write, Peter Thiel is totally gay, people. This is the headline of the piece. This is his sort of rude awakening, his sort of rude introduction to Gawker. An early Gawker memo sort of defines the essential Gawker voice. It says there should be a glint of meanness or nastiness in every article, and this is Thiel's introduction. Gawker is the sort of rebellious upstart. It's the site that's willing to say the things that other people aren't willing to say. It's going to say them in the way that other people aren't willing to say them. So they out Peter Thiel in 2007, and we think that's what's the impetus. But really, what's actually happening around the same time, just before Gawker writes his first post about Thiel, a man named Hulk Hogan or Terry Bollea, as his friends and family know him, happens to be going through a bit of a rough patch. His wife has left him. He ends up giving about 70% of his marital assets up in the divorce. The real estate market has crashed. His $25 million mansion sells for less than $10 million. He considers committing suicide. His career is in tatters. His body is falling apart. And in this moment, he confides in his best friend, a man legally named Bubba the Love Sponge, a Florida DJ, that he could use some comfort. And Bubba picks him up and takes him to his house and then says, "Do you want to have sex with my wife?" And Hulk Hogan says, "Sure." And they do several times on several occasions. But what he doesn't know is that in the smoke detector on the wall, maybe like that one, or a light like that one, is a red blinking light, a camera, that this is being recorded. And he does not know that not only is his illicit sexual relationship with his best friend's wife being recorded, but all of his comments are being recorded, including a number of appalling racist remarks that he makes as he vents in this in this bedroom, as his life is falling apart. And then he goes on his way, the relationship inevitably fizzles out, and he thinks that his life goes back to normal. And it goes back to normal for Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel, although his investment fund Clarium does not do well in the interim period between when he is outed and when the sex tape is recorded, a little company called Facebook does, in fact, go public. He owns 10% of it. His $500,000 investment is worth well over $1 billion, most of which he takes in cash at the IPO. And it's a surreal series of events. After Gawker had outed Thiel, he just sat on it. In retrospect, it seems like he must have acted immediately, but he just sits on it. This thing sort of rests in the back of his mind. He doesn't like that a site could do this to a person. He knows it's not illegal per se, but he finds it to be unethical or a bit gross. He reaches out to Gawker. He reaches out to a number of former Gawker employees. He he has a meeting with Corey Sitcha, the former Gawker editor, and Corey would say that Thiel was almost as naive as Nick Carraway was. He says, why do people write these things about other people? Why do they write about other people at all? He's sort of stunned that this can happen, that this is allowed. He's rudely informed by Corey, or realistically informed about how these things work, what the job of the media is, what the job of a gossip journalist is. And Thiel walks away disappointed. And I think he walks away, he says he felt like he had two options. One, which was to simply let this go and move on. And two would be to do something outside traditional channels, right? And he says that in 2011, he leaves convinced that the option outside of traditional channels is his only option. This would be conspiracy. He hardens, as Denton would say, he hardens on this idea of doing something untraditional, some might say unethical, but certainly unexpected and certainly in secret. Then in 2011, he has a meeting with a young college student, a man that I only identify as Mr. A per my agreement with the source. They sit down in Berlin, the perfect town or the perfect city to discuss a conspiracy given its Cold War history. And as they're sitting there, Thiel is complaining about Gawker. He's complaining about what they've written about him. He's complaining about what they've written about his friends. He's complaining about this sort of negative role he feels that they have in culture as a suppressor of individuality, as an enforcer of political correctness. And he is looking at this 26-year-old across from him, and the 26-year-old says, well, you should do something about it. And Thiel says, well, there's nothing you can do about it. This is him reflecting back the thing that he'd heard from everyone that he'd talked to, that he'd taken from Corey, that he'd taken from Eddie Hayes, the notorious New York City fixer, the mob lawyer that he'd spoken to about it. And Mr. A looks him in the eye, and I mean, the stones on this 26-year-old to say this to a billionaire. He says, Peter, if everyone in the world thought this way, what would the world look like? And it strikes me that there's probably not a more manipulative thing that you could say to someone like Peter Thiel. It challenges his very identity as a contrarian, as a person who does the things that you're not supposed to do, who doesn't believe in political correctness or sort of the traditional boundaries on this or that. It's the perfect line meant to provoke Thiel. And then Mr. A goes into his pitch. He says, look, I think we could create a shell company that would go after Gawker, that we could hire investigative reporters and lawyers who would troll through Gawker's archives, that would data mine, to use Palantir's language, the other company that Thiel has founded and is also worth billions of dollars. I think we could find buried within this archive of millions of posts, or probably close to 1 million at that time, that we could find some law that they've broken, something wrong that they've done, some mistake that they've made. A Gawker writer would say later that what he loved about working at Gawker was that it was a company that was not afraid to fuck up. And I think that's what readers liked about it as well. The problem is, in 2007, they'd picked a fight with someone who was now explicitly looking for those mistakes and then looking to put the full weight of his resources and energy and anger at exploiting one of those mistakes and making them pay for it. And so they begin to troll through the archives. They find some cases where, some articles where plaintiffs have threatened to sue Gawker, in other cases where they have in fact sued Gawker, but the lawsuit did not go very far. Examples where perhaps the person had a legitimate case. Thiel decides very early on that he wants to avoid cases that directly involve the First Amendment, right? First Amendment is the bulwark that media protects itself with. It's enshrined in the Constitution, obviously. So Thiel thinks this is not the opportunity, right? He's always looking for the edge, the black edge, the things that other people aren't thinking. And so he says, what I want are copyright violations. What I want are invasions of privacy claims. Perhaps Gawker is operating in violation of some tax law or international tax law. He thinks perhaps there's some violation of FTC guidelines. Perhaps there are employment law violations. Perhaps there's any number of mistakes that Gawker made as the rebellious upstart, the untraditional company, the company that's not afraid to make mistakes. What is a mistake that they've made that they don't believe that they're vulnerable for? And this is where he wants to put all his energy. I have a line from John Boyd, the fighter pilot. He says, the fighter pilot always goes through the back door, never the front door. And that's really what Thiel was doing. The front door would be to challenge Gawker on the things they simply wrote about people, a snarky post, an unfair headline, a mean article. And this is where people had typically challenged Gawker, right? You wrote something negative about me, I'm going to sue you for that thing. Those were notoriously difficult cases to win. And in fact, no one had gotten very far in doing so. And so Thiel begins to look through all these things. He's been patiently waiting. And they find a few cases that they think have potential. The lawyer he's hired is a man named Charles Harder. Charles Harder only knows that he's been hired by this Mr. A character. He does not know who his backer is. And they don't manage to find anything right away. It takes, they start this in April 2011. And by mid-2012, they've not made much progress. As the fall of 2012 begins, Gawker makes a catastrophic unforced error. They receive anonymously in the mail this sex tape involving Hulk Hogan. It's a 30-minute unedited DVD of one of the tapes involving Hogan. And where did this tape come from? Well, who recorded, or how did it get into anyone's hands? Well, this is where the story takes a very strange twist, an almost unreal twist. What happened was Bubba the Love Sponge had recorded the tape, and then he and his wife had gotten a divorce. And the possession of these tapes actually came up as an asset in their divorce. They argued over who gets the illegally recorded sex tape of their friends, one of which is rumored, and again, this is a rumor, but this does pop up from time to time in the trial. One of these tapes may involve General Petraeus and a number of FBI agents who are an FBI agent who's friends with Bubba Clem, and a number of other celebrities as well. So Bubba gets the tapes in the divorce, right? To shorten it, he gets the tapes, and he hides them in his desk at work, at the radio station. He locks them in his desk, and then during an office move, a rival DJ, who I won't name because he has not been charged with this, but a rival DJ steals these tapes, which for some reason he knew existed, and then, not to embarrass Hulk Hogan, but to embarrass the DJ whose time slot he wanted to have, he begins to shop these tapes to the media, hoping to show, to use a term that wasn't popular now, that his rival is a cuck, right? That his rival likes watching other men have sex with his wife. He thinks this will be very bad for Bubba the Love Sponge's career. It's unclear why he thinks that would be the case. But he begins to shop them to the media. He shows a sample of the tapes to TMZ. TMZ, another reporter at TMZ, who I won't name because, again, not charged with it, refers him to a lawyer named Keith M. Davidson, who was a broker of these tapes. The reporter, I guess, tells this anonymous DJ that if he works with Davidson, he might be able to get money for the tapes. And so they begin to leak more of the tapes. They try to get it on TMZ. They try other websites. And then they settle on Gawker. And they leak the 30-minute DVD to Gawker, knowing that Gawker will run it, because Gawker tends to run just about anything that they think will be provocative or get attention. This is the prime story for them. They send it to him. Gawker runs it a few days later. Gawker thinks they're getting a scoop. They don't realize that they are being used as a cat's paw in an extortion campaign. This is the conspiracy within the conspiracy, if it's not confusing enough. They're the cat's paw. They run the tape. This is Davidson later tells Hogan's personal attorney that leaking the tape was the shot across the bow to get Hogan's attention, to then pay for the tapes. He pays for them. They negotiate a $300,000 price. They go to a hotel room. They negotiate the sale of the tapes. It just happens that the FBI has been called, and the FBI is waiting in the next hotel room. They catch Keith Davidson. They think it's you could not have been caught extorting someone more red-handedly. but he ultimately is never charged for the crime. Flash forward a little bit, he goes on to then extort Donald Trump with Stormy Daniels, and I'm forgetting the other porn star's name, but the two porn stars who Donald Trump paid off after allegedly having an affair, both of these deals were brokered by the same lawyer who was let free by the FBI. So obviously Donald Trump doesn't like the FBI. I would say most of his dislike is not particularly justified. But in this one case, he has a legitimate bone to pick with the FBI, who clearly dropped the ball. Anyways, the tape is leaked. Hogan has threatened to sue if the tapes run. They do run. He sues. 2 cease and desists are sent to Gawker. The final of which pleads with Nick Denton as a human being not to take down the tape. Denton declines. Probably the most expensive ignored cease and desist in history. $100 million lawsuit files with Thiel's backing. The lawsuit, which was a relatively simple case. Can you run an illegally recorded sex tape or can't you? This should have gone to trial rather quickly. It doesn't. Gawker digs in. It fights it as hard as they can, which is part of Gawker's legal strategy. They understand that most people don't have an appetite nor the money to fight against a media outlet. As Thiel would say, as only Thiel would say, Hogan, as a single-digit millionaire, could have hardly afforded to spend the $10+ million that went into fighting this case. It eventually gets to a jury, to a trial. A lot of things happen along the way. I'm happy to answer questions about it. But anyways, it gets to a jury. Cases never get to a jury. There's an exchange between Thiel and Hogan that I think is interesting. He doesn't know he's speaking to Hogan. Hogan doesn't know he's speaking to Thiel, but there's a term in wrestling, kayfabe. Wrestling is kayfabe. It's scripted, right? The outcome is scripted. What happens in the ring is partially unpredictable, but the outcome is scripted. But sometimes a real fight breaks out, and this is called a shoot. And some of the most notorious matches in professional wrestling, real feuds have happened and it goes into a shoot. And so Thiel, as they're on the verge of trial, as Gawker has confidently thought the entire time that this will settle, that Hogan will eventually run out of money, that the jury will obviously see through, will not find a celebrity who had sex with his best friend's wife to be particularly sympathetic. Gawker thinks that the outcome is scripted in the way that almost every lawsuit is scripted. 99% of lawsuits settle. They rarely go to trial. Catastrophic verdicts are rarely won. And Thiel, on the verge of trial, he says to Hogan, they think that this is kayfabe, but it's about to become a shoot. And it does. The trial is devastating. Gawker is not well prepared. Gawker is not particularly sympathetic either to the jury, which Thiel has stacked with particularly sympathetic jurors. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on jury consultants and mock trials. And then the verdict comes in, and it's devastating. It's $140+ million against Gawker. In Florida, you have to post a bond worth the size of the verdict to be able to appeal, which is capped at $50 million. So Gawker doesn't have the $50 million. It's essentially an immediate bankruptcy level event. The site closes the site declares bankruptcy and then closes just a few months later. And Thiel did it. Thiel had set out to do the equivalent of fixing the 1919 World Series, and he had done it. Nick Carraway asked Gatsby, how did Wolfsheim do this? And he says he saw the opportunity and he took it. And that's what happened with Thiel. He saw the opportunity that no one else saw. He took it, and he was successful. And for a few months, he got away with it. And if he had gotten away with it, we wouldn't be talking. No one would probably know that this occurred. We'd think that Hulk Hogan pulled off a miraculous victory in Pinellas County merely on the merits of his case, and that would be that. But Thiel is unmasked, and then the story takes the ominous characterization that it now has. And so I set out, I get to the bottom of this. I encapsulate the story, and then I have to write this goddamn thing. And it was not easy. I was looking in my journal this morning. I write, I have this journal, they probably sell it here. You write one sentence every day. I started this book on February 7th. And then basically every subsequent entry is me talking about how impossible it is, and I don't think I'll ever finish. And then here I am. It's not something I thought, I don't know how I thought it would go. I don't know where I thought this story would go, but it's been a bit of a crazy ride. And started on February 7th. I was looking at my files. The last copy edit went in on November 12th. The last pre-production edit went in the first week of December, and then the first books came out off the printer on February 1. I would say perhaps the most nerve-wracking part of the process was the day it came off the printer, and both Nick and Peter were told, look, you can see the book after it's come off the printer when it's not possible to be edited in any way. And so it goes to Thiel, and this is a man who just spent an incredible fortune destroying someone for something he didn't like. I would say that was probably the most nerve-wracking part. More recently, it went to Charles Harder, who himself not only obviously participated in the Gawker conspiracy, but represented the Trump administration and Donald Trump specifically in their attempts to stop the publication of Michael Wolff's book. So getting the email a few days later from Charles Harder asking if he could please see a copy, that he was excited to read it, I would say it was equally nerve-wracking. And I would wrap up with two quick things. One, the book was my own conspiracy, right? Only a few people at my publisher knew what it was titled. Very few people knew I was writing this book. You can see on the timeline, it just says UMB. Our code word for it was Untitled Media Book. We knew if word got out that I was working on it, that other reporters who have worked extensively on this story would try to beat me. We did a little deception of our own. When we announced that the book was coming out, we said it would be released in the early winter of 2017, and we announced it late enough in the process that this would be an impossible deadline to beat for anyone else. And I think we deterred a few people from pursuing it, which was fun. You know, getting to practice maybe some of the tactics of the book was an interesting experience. The book came out yesterday. I thought two final things, right? Thiel's question that he famously asks people is, what do you believe that nobody else believes? Or what's an unpopular belief that you hold that very few people you know hold? The unpopular belief in this book might be that what happened here, whether we agree with it or not, whether we're scared by it or not, is at the very least a playbook for anyone trying to disrupt the status quo, to change things, to do the kinds of things that require secrecy and cunning, that perhaps need to be a fait accompli, right? Once the decision is in, it changes things, but if you were to ask people in advance, whether you were to try to get buy-in, whether you were to try to be transparent about them, it might not work. You know, Thiel takes on a sort of a villainous cast when he endorses Donald Trump in the 2016 election. He speaks at the convention. He donates money right after Trump's lowest moment in the campaign, and then Trump wins. It strikes me that what Thiel did against Gawker, again, agree with it or not, is at least perhaps a playbook to consider for anyone looking to take down what I think is the worst president in modern history. I thought that was an interesting thought. And then I thought I'd conclude with one last thing, which is the epigraph from the book was something I sat on for. I looked at my Amazon receipts this morning. I found this quote in 2011, and I loved it. And I thought one day this will be a book, and so this will be in a book. And it came full circle. And it's from Walker Percy's Lancelot. He says, "I couldn't stand it. I still can't stand it. I can't stand the way things are. I cannot tolerate this age. What is more, I won't. That was my discovery, that I didn't have to." And I feel like that encapsulates Thiel's motivation. I feel like that encapsulates the universality of what happened, the potential lessons that can be drawn from this nearly unbelievable conspiracy. And then, of course, it is worth noting that the man who says this line in Lancelot is a deranged psychopath, likely schizophrenic, who murders his his whole family, and then is sentenced to jail for it. So let's end on that positive note. Should I do the couple questions? So there's a couple questions that I thought I would answer, and then if everyone wants to think of some questions, I'm happy to answer them. So we'll do that. Let's see. Someone said, how do I book Ryan for an interview? You could just email me. Someone said, you should have a conversation with Sam Harris on his podcast. I should. It's a wonderful podcast. He's an interesting person. What do we got here? Someone said, from your title, this book seems to be in contrast with my ideas in Perennial Seller. I wrote a book about how you create work that lasts, how it stands the test of time. And I think what everyone got wrong is that when they reported this story is they reported it journalistically, right? Here are the facts, here are the dates, here's the boring minutia of this and that. And to me, what happened here was an epic story that reads as if it happened 150 years ago, or it happened in Shakespeare's time, or it's a story out of Plutarch's Lives. It's the Count of Monte Cristo as well. It's an epic tale from history. And so I decided to tell it that way. I think I tried to take these events, which are very much of the moment, and make them and present them in a way, in the way that I read them, that I observed them, which was less from a position of judgment and more from a position of just pure fascination. I would say, I said, you noted in an interview that Denton and Delario were more thoughtful and mature now about these issues than they had been at the time. Is there something the rest of the media can learn from this? I would say that actually the most revealing and interesting interviews I had were with AJ and Nick. I found them to be the most introspective and thoughtful about what happened. I would say they surprised me. I went in with some preconceived notions and they shattered them. You know, there's, in some ways, like, the character is in the losing, right? The lesson is in being on the wrong side of this. The going bankrupt, AJ waking up one morning and finding there's a $230 million hold on his checking account. That's the kind of thing that shakes someone to their core, whether they did something wrong, that someone invited these circumstances or not. And so I found that both of them were wiser and more introspective, and I think kinder and more empathetic as a result of what happened. And look, there's less character and introspection in winning a stunning victory. I don't think Hogan walked away from this particularly reflective, right? For him, this is a validation that he was wrong, that he did nothing wrong. And I think the same for Thiel as well, right? So I found them to be fascinating. There was a Gawker article that came out towards when I was finishing the book. I'm forgetting the name of the writer, but he sat down with Anne Hathaway for a movie interview that they were doing, and he had to come to terms with the fact that he had previously run an upskirt photo that a paparazzi photographer had taken of her, and he joked about it, that this was funny. He took this person's moment of personal vulnerability and shame, and he turned it into page views, and he was reflecting about it, and he was chastened, and he did sort of think differently as a result of it. But what is interesting about his reaction is that he didn't seem to think that there should be much in the way of consequences for what happened. And I think that's characteristic of a lot of the media's reaction. They said, oh, Gawker shouldn't have run this article, or that Gawker did make a mistake, or yes, it was wrong. But the idea that you could commit a wrong on that level and be so unapologetic for so long and fight it for so hard and be so unremorseful for so long, and that then it's somehow unfair that you are eventually held accountable for what happened in a court of law, a law that's vetted by a judge and a jury in the state of Florida that finds you guilty, to me seemed naive. And I'll do one more question. This book mentions the nihilism in youth culture that was embodied in Gawker. Where do you see this nihilism currently play out that can be identified? Well, I think what's so fascinating about this, I think Gawker was, in some ways, and Nick said this too, it had drifted towards nihilism, a sort of overarching cynicism about everything and everyone and everything that happens. And I think that was what Thiel found most objectionable, that he sought to change. But the irony is that in the pursuit of that, he empowers the alt-right and he empowers Donald Trump, who undoubtedly embodies this nihilism and this cynicism and this sort of I want to watch the world burn mentality more than Gawker ever did. And so that is something that one must consider about a conspiracy, that it not only might not have accomplished what he hoped to accomplish, but it may have made things worse. So, do we have time for a couple? All right. Anyone got questions? Let's do it.
Hey, thanks so much. My question is, how come they didn't figure out who was funding Hulk Hogan? How come there wasn't a money trail there?
So one reason they didn't find out is Thiel's use of a cutout, right? Thiel hires a person who hires a lawyer, and creating this buffer allowed Charles Harder to not know who his own benefactor was, which made it, of course, much harder for Gawker to find out. I think the other Thiel would say, he would say the hyperbolic way of describing this, he would say, what does it say that an investigative journalism outlet is unable to successfully investigate a conspiracy being directed against? And that is a bit of a turning of the knife. That's somewhat of an unfair dig, but there is an element of truth to that. What's fascinating is that in the middle of the trial, Dan Abrams writes an article, and the headline is someone secretly funding Hulk Hogan's lawsuit? And I think this article did 52 Facebook shares. So it's ignored by everyone, the media, Gawker, all, even though it's right there in front of them. There's also a moment in 2014 where they suspect something's going on, they accuse Charles Harder of it, and then they forget and they move on, kind of. So it is, I think, part of it was it sounded insane to say there is a conspiracy being aimed against us, that this is more than what it is. And that, in some ways, that fear of embarrassment, of looking foolish, prevented them from seeing what was immediately in front of them.
I was wondering why did you decide to take this take on the conspiracies? Whether it's a neutral word,
yeah,
maybe there should be more. Clearly, you've been thinking about this before from the epigraph, but I was just wondering why.
Yeah, I mean, the epigraph isn't really about a conspiracy, but it's just this idea that, maybe someone can do something, right? Maybe someone can be just insane enough to try to do something about something. A conspiracy is a neutral word, right? I mean, words are neutral. How we use them, what context we use them in, is what changes their meaning or creates the context which the meaning is derived. And so there's all sorts of good conspiracies in history, right? The conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar is a good conspiracy, we might say. The conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln is probably a bad conspiracy, right? Depending, I guess, on your political beliefs or if you're a racist or something. But so there's good conspiracies and bad conspiracies. The founding of America every rebellion is a conspiracy, right? The line from, I believe it's Ben Franklin, is that we must all hang together or we shall hang separately, right? The founding of America is a conspiracy. It's a secret act to steal the colonies from the British Empire. And so what I took away from what happened was less whether it should have happened or shouldn't have happened, and I wanted to focus on what did happen. And then once we understand it, then we can make that judgment afterwards. And I felt like that's what the reader is to do, and my job is to present the facts in that way.
Yeah, hi. You said that you were confronted with the research for this book early in 2017, yes?
No, it would have been late 2016 going into 2015.
Were you writing this book concurrently with Perennial Seller, and how did you juggle those two, if you were?
So I actually sold Perennial Seller in 2015, and I've worked on different. Perennial Seller was a sort of slow book that started small and became much bigger. So I don't think I was really writing Perennial Seller while I was doing this, but I was finishing it and polishing it. So they did somewhat overlap, and I did try to. When you look at most narrative nonfiction, tends to be, I think, too based in the present moment. It assumes too much background knowledge of the reader, and it focuses on the moment. And I tried to write this book as if the events had happened 100 years ago, or that someone was reading it 100 years in the future and they didn't know or care who Gawker or Peter Thiel was. I wanted to make it more like, the Count of Monte Cristo or something like that.
This isn't related to the book, but
Okay.
do you think the Stoics were wrong about anything, or do you disagree with them strongly on any matter?
Well, look, there's a line in Marcus Aurelius begins his meditations with a list of things that he's grateful for, right? Things that he's proud of doing. One of the things he says he's proud of is not raping his slaves, right? He said, I'm proud that I never touched my slaves. If you own someone, there's no consent, right? So we're talking about a rather disgusting sort of thing to pat yourself on the back for. Slavery cuts through and through in the Stoics. I mean, Seneca talks about how slave owners should be pitied because they are slaves to their slaves, right? As he owned slaves. So slavery would be a huge one. Marcus Aurelius persecutes the Christians. You know, Marcus Aurelius lets Commodus, a deranged psychopath himself, succeed him in as emperor. Seneca is the tutor to the Nero. You know, there's plenty of things wrong with the Stoics that they were definitely wrong about. In the back? Oh.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things about Thiel, it seems like his your inability to kind of place him in a box. Like, surely you remember at the convention last year when he said, I am gay, I'm a Republican, and it was kind of a big aha moment.
Yeah.
And I was kind of wondering how, like, in your extended conversations with him, how you kind of rectified his work, you know, as kind of a libertarian with, you know, both the methods that he applies here, kind of turning to the government, the FBI to kind of seek his case, and like his work, even at like Palantir, which has been criticized for like working with the NSA, like, what kind of guy is this?
No, it's interesting. He even defies the label of libertarian in that he supports Donald Trump, right? And so he is one of Thiel's friends would say that at any given time there's a Mexican standoff in Thiel's head between two mutually exclusive, incompatible ideas, and he's considering them always from a new perspective constantly. I think Thiel is sort of one of those first principles thinkers, like that he goes to instead of thinking about precedent, and instead of thinking about what other people think, instead of thinking about what the easiest thing to think is, or the thing that will get him in the least trouble, he comes up with some wildly original take on just about anything and everything. Sometimes it gets him in trouble, a lot of trouble, and sometimes he comes up with things that no one else would have thought of. So he does defy boxes in those ways. I think you could very much argue that Nick Denton is the same way, and perhaps I say in the book that it turned out that the town was not big enough for the two of them, and that set them on this collision course like your prototypical Western, and just happened that, you know, Thiel drew first.
Hey, Ryan.
Hey.
I am curious about how the anatomy of intrigue.
Yes.
There seems to be a thematic coherence with the manipulation of media and perhaps confessions thereof.
Yes.
How do the two link in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I went with this subtitle because I wanted it to be more than about just this case. I found in this conspiracy that it was so sort of methodical and well thought out. It wasn't impulsive really in any way, that it was in some ways a sort of a step-by-step guide or like master course in a conspiracy, right? It's got all the elements. And so I tried to make the book sort of a lens with which to examine this larger topic. I'm certainly fascinated by these things that are kind of beyond the pale, the things that people are, you know, people find Machiavelli or Saul Alinsky or these people repulsive, and they condemn them. But I think in some ways their unvarnished honesty is something that we need to understand. Like with Robert Greene's work, he's not saying this is what you should do or this is how the world should be, saying this is some picture of how the world actually is. And I think we need to understand that fully and then decide how we want to be in that world or what we want to do with this information. And so I think my first book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, was both a how-to guide, I've said, and also a please don't guide, right? I felt like that book was supposed to be showing how this works so it would not work anymore. And in some ways, what I was just saying came true, is just that a lot of people, particularly people in the media, did not want to see it and did not want to see it that way. And a lot of these vulnerabilities stood there sort of naked and exposed. And the last year has been year and a half has been an unpleasant wake-up call about that, because the Russians understood it, and Trump understood it, and the alt-right understands it. And now you could say that sort of good and decent people are suffering as a result of that.
Hey, Ryan, back
Yes.
here. Thanks for coming.
Of course.
My question connects the contents of this book with one of your past ones. So I actually just finished reading Trust Me, I'm Lying a few weeks ago. Really liked it.
Thank you.
I particularly enjoyed the one chapter where you drew a parallel between traditional journalism from like 150 years ago and current journalism, how it evolved from like political mouthpieces to yellow journalism to the subscription model of the New York Times, et cetera. So I have kind of a two-part question, which is, do you think this Gawker lawsuit is pushing us away from the kind of yellow journalism that plagues online media? And I think from a more kind of personal point of view, I actually like run my own e-commerce company. We have our own blog. What can we do to also push the general industry away from the yellow journalism you see online towards more just honest and thorough journalism?
Well, Thiel's argument was that Gawker was a product of a unique time and period of the early internet when blogging wasn't taken seriously. It was able to grow and expand quickly and sort of lodge itself in the online media landscape, but that if it was made to go away, if it was destroyed, it would be impossible to, those circumstances would never align again, and that if Gawker simply disappeared, he says, if you get this case in front of a jury, the jury can tell history to stop. Or technology to stop, is what he was saying. And I think there's some element that, in some ways, that is borne out. Unintended consequences aside, a number of former Gawker writers tried to launch a Kickstarter to raise $500,000, which I don't think was nearly enough to buy it. I don't think that bid would have been successful even if they had. But they launched this Kickstarter campaign to try to get the crowd to say, hey, let's bring this back. And, they raised like 16% of their goal or something like that. And to me, that is a validation of his idea that people liked Gawker while it existed, and they would read it. But if forced to create it again from scratch, that probably wouldn't happen. So I thought that was an interesting argument. Want to do one more? Sorry, let's do one more.
You mentioned, or you were discussing that Peter Thiel was creative in his, or he had a different perspective that allowed him to kind of have this idea to do something amazing,
or villainous,
or
whatever,
villainous,
or however you decide.
Whatever.
Yes, right.
But he also is a billionaire. So why isn't, like, I hear you suggesting, we should really have, our different perspectives can allow for different things to happen,
Sure.
but maybe it's just lots of money allows for different things to happen.
Well, I think the interesting argument is at the beginning of this story, who is the more powerful person, right? Is it Thiel, who has money, or is it Denton and Gawker, who has a website that in 2007 is doing 30 million page views a month? There's lots of rich people. There's very few. There's fewer media outlets than really rich people, right? And there are media outlets are almost never found held accountable for what they say, right? That's mostly a good thing, right? Mostly media is protected; they can sort of do whatever they want. Dumas in The Count of Monte Cristo says a king of the press has a throne everywhere, right? I would say that a media baron is much more powerful than a rich person at the outset. And if you think about this case, it took 10 years, it took $10 million, and at the end, it could have gone either way, right? So even with all his power and cunning and resources, Thiel almost didn't win. And so in some ways, to me, if you squint hard enough, you could actually see this as an underdog story. Because name one other case where name one other instance where someone has done this. I look, there's almost none, right? The press is undefeated, again, mostly for good reasons. But if you think about it as this underdog story, it takes on a different light. And yes, of course, he had resources, he could fight. But what does it say that Hulk Hogan, one of the most famous people on the planet, a single-digit millionaire, would have been unable to do this on his own? right? He would have had, we say that, you know, he manipulated the system. That's the argument of Gawker sort of partisans. But the truth is, if he had not been backed by a billionaire, he would not have had effective access to the legal system. He would have been incapable of getting, we think that the legal system is fair, but he would have been unable to get to a jury verdict without the secret help of a billionaire. And so that's a different way of looking at it, and that's sort of what I tried to say in the book. Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Thank you all for coming. I'll sign books, obviously.